Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters from quiltingismytherapy.com, and welcome to the Dot to Dot Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. Throughout this 6-video series, I'm showing you how to use a dot to dot quilting technique to create some pretty amazing designs, if I do say so myself. And in this video, we're taking some of the things we learned in prior videos and putting them together to create all new designs. So in the very first video, we saw how to quilt the diamond design and the starburst design. And then we learned some variations of each of those. In this video, we're gonna put those two shapes together and create even more design options. I'll also share some practical tips on using these dot to dot designs in irregularly shaped areas. I'm gonna demonstrate how to quilt them on a sewing machine and a long arm, and give you practical tips on how to use them on your quilts. So let's get to it. Combining the diamond design and the starburst not only creates some unique variations, we can also use this idea to make other blocks easier to quilt. For instance, if I'm working on a block that's a little too big for me, I can use that diamond design on half of the block to shrink it down and then quilt that starburst design in the remaining area. So we learned the diamond design in an earlier episode. Basically, I'm just quilting a line that angles out and stops inside the next corner and then touches the next. Now normally when quilting this design, I'll do both sides of the block. However, in this example, I'm only doing part of the block. And depending on how big the block is or how much quilting I want in it, I can add another line to shrink it down even more. So far, so good. I have that diamond design in half of my block, and in the remaining area, I'm gonna quilt that starburst design. So I'm gonna travel along the edge to get the opposite corner. In the last video, we saw how we can quilt those wedges so that they extend from the corner of the block, and that's what I'm gonna do right here. So starting from that point, I'm just gonna quilt my first wedge that goes towards the center, echo that previously quilted line, and return home. Then I'm gonna do the same on the other side. Now, if this seems like a lot to remember, don't worry. I have a free downloadable PDF with quilting diagrams and tips, so be sure to check that out to learn how to do this design. And once I'm finished, I have a unique looking design that combines the two shapes to create a beautiful look. And while you might be impressed thinking, oh, that looks so custom, we know I did it just because it makes quilting that area easier. Now in this example, I added that diamond design on the top of the block, but you can do it the other way around. So looking at this bigger block, I'm gonna quilt that diamond design on one side of the block, just like we saw previously, except I'm gonna quilt my wedges so they extend from the center of that diamond design. Now you can do this in two different parts by quilting one and then the other, or you can do it in one continuous motion, which is how I'm gonna show it to you right now. But just know that as you're quilting, you can go about these designs in the arrangement that you feel comfortable quilting. So I'm gonna start by quilting that diamond design, going from one corner, stopping at a point just about an inch or so inside the other corner, and then on to touch the opposite. And just a reminder, if you don't hit those dots perfectly, don't worry about it, because when you erase them, nobody's gonna know where they were supposed to be. So I have my first line, and I'm gonna do another one that angles out, stopping just about an inch or so inside that previously quilted one. This is where it gets a little different. If I wanted to, I could go ahead and quilt out to that opposite corner and finish this design. Then I could start a new line of quilting back at this point, quilting my wedges so they extend from right here. However, we know that I don't like to start a new line of quilting unless it's absolutely necessary. So what I'm gonna do is just put a pause on my diamond design and quilt those wedges in the remaining area. So basically, I'm just imagining that I have that final quilted line, but I'm not gonna do it quite yet. So in this area is where I'm gonna quilt those wedges so they extend from my home base, echo the side, and come back. And just like we've already seen in a previous episode, I'm gonna quilt those wedges so they fill the area in as completely as possible and return back to that home base. Now, if you haven't watched the prior videos in this series, be sure to go back and check them out, because this might not make any sense to you if you haven't seen it. Now that I have half of that area filled in, I'm gonna do the same on the other side. But don't forget, I'm eventually gonna need to work my way out right here. If you're worried that you might forget, you can go ahead and just mark that line, just to have it as a boundary for your area. And we've already seen in those earlier episodes when we talked about the starburst design that you don't have to use a ruler for quilting this. It's totally up to you. You can freehand it or use your ruler. Now don't forget, when you're quilting this on a sewing machine, you can change the orientation of your quilt so that you're quilting in the direction that you feel comfortable quilting. If you're doing this on a long arm, you're gonna have to get comfortable using that ruler in all different directions. Then once I've filled in that area with my wedges, I can quilt my last line back out to that opposite corner and then move on. Now this design not only makes bigger blocks easier to manage, it also creates really cool secondary patterns when used between blocks. For instance, around a star. So when you start seeing this design used in multiple blocks, you might be surprised on the secondary patterns that can come out. So whether you use that diamond design to shrink the top of a block or the bottom, or you quilt those wedges so they come from the center or the corner, the result is going to be a complex looking design that just might make quilting a little bit easier. Up to this point, we've seen dot-to-dot designs in squares and rectangles and triangles, but not every quilt is going to have blocks of that shape. In this section, I'm going to show you how to use these dot-to-dot quilting designs in irregularly shaped areas. I'm not just talking about improvisationally pieced blocks. I'm referring to any block that's not your standard square, rectangle, or triangle shape. It could be a pieced block, it could be in between blocks, or even a combination of the two. While every quilt and situation is different, I'm going to share some tips that will help you use your blocks in these types of areas. And the first way you can use the dot-to-dot quilting designs in these areas is to use the edges of the block as a guide. And we're going to do that using the starburst design. Now when I've talked about the starburst design up to this point, you might have noticed that I've said stuff like echo the edge instead of quilt a horizontal line. That's because I was preparing you for this moment right here. Using the edges of the block as a guide means I'll have a design that really fits the block and is easy to quilt. For instance, let's check out this area right here. All I have to do is pick a home base and use the edges of the block as a guide. So starting from that home base, I'm going to quilt a line that goes out to the opposite side, echoes the side, and comes back. So far, it's very similar to how we quilt the starburst design within triangle blocks. And I'm going to quilt my second wedge the same way, just swinging out, keeping it close, echoing the side of the block, and then coming in. And of course, you can add more or less wedges, you can make them bigger or smaller, you could add echoing inside of them or not. It truly is a choose your own quilting adventure. We learned in that earlier episode that where we put our home base is where all those lines are going to go to. So I want to make sure that that point is an area I want to show off, as it's really going to draw the eye to that point. Now, as I'm filling in those irregular areas, that means some of my wedges will be smaller and some will be larger, but the most important thing here is I fill in the whole area as completely as possible. And when I'm finished, I have a design that fills in that irregularly shaped area and looks amazing. This technique will work in most areas, but there's some places it won't work in, depending on where you put the home base, or for instance, areas that have edges with a lot of points. But if you're looking at a portion of your quilt and you're not sure if it's going to work out, go ahead and mark out the design. If you can mark it continuously without picking up your pen, you can quilt it. And you can also use this technique to combine smaller blocks to make one bigger block to fill in. And let me show you what that looks like on the Longarm. I'm using these two blocks as my irregularly shaped area, and I've picked this as my home base. Now I can use the edges of the area as a guide for my design by quilting wedges that extend from that point to fill in the area. I like to quilt my center wedge first, so I'm going to start by quilting an on-point wedge like this. Then I'll continue quilting wedges to one side, filling in the area as much as possible and using the edge of the blocks as a guide. Now as I quilt the wedges so that they extend all the way to the edge, you may notice that some of the lines are longer than the others. I'm not worried about the size of my wedges, I'm more focused on filling in that area as completely as possible. Now once I've quilted one side of the area with wedges, I'm going to do the same on the other side. Now since I'm quilting this on a Longarm, I'm using a ruler to help quilt those diagonal lines. But if quilting this on a sewing machine, you could freehand it if you prefer. If you want to learn a little bit more about quilting with rulers on a Longarm or a sewing machine, you can check out my free video series, Machine Quilting with Rulers, Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. You can find that by visiting quiltingismytherapy.com or by checking out my YouTube channel. And when I'm finished, I have a dot-to-dot design that fills in that whole area and looks lovely. The second tip for dealing with those irregularly shaped areas is to use the quilting to make the area a different shape. This one is one of my favorites because it leaves a lot of room for improvisation. I'm going to show you what this looks like using the pineapple design. But before we get to learning how to use that pineapple design in irregularly shaped areas, let me show you how it goes together. I like to call this design the pineapple design because it resembles the pointy, spiky top of a pineapple. It may look complicated, but it's the same steps over and over again. So I'm going to quilt the pineapple design in this triangle shaped area. It's going to start off just like the triangle diamond design, going from one corner, stopping about an inch or so inside that next corner, and then going on to touch the opposite corner. If you're quilting this design on your sewing machine, don't forget that you can reposition the quilt to make the design easier for you to quilt. And there we have that first line. Now what I'm going to do is a little bit of stitching in the ditch. I'm going to travel along that seam about an inch or so, and then quilt a line down to that point, and back up to the other side, trying to keep it about an inch or so away from the other corner as well. If you wanted to, you can mark out those reference lines to make sure it's perfectly symmetrical, but I think that eyeballing it will make it close enough. Now that I'm away from that corner, I'm going to quilt another line that goes to that previously quilted corner and back up to the other side. I basically just created another triangle shaped area to fill in, and I'm going to repeat doing that same diamond design within that area. Quilting a line that goes to about an inch or so inside that previously quilted corner and continuing on to the original starting point. And there I have the second part of my spiky pineapple design. Depending on how big the block is or how much room you have, you can keep repeating those steps to fill in the area. And I'm going to go ahead and do one more. So I'm going to travel along the edge, quilt a line that goes down to that previously quilted corner and up to the opposite side, trying to keep it about an inch or so away from the other line. Then I'm going to fill in that area with that same diamond design, returning back to the starting point. Then once I'm finished filling in that area, if I want to, I can continue traveling along the edge of the block to get to the next section and continue quilting another design. And while this design does incorporate that stitching along the ditch on one side of the block, the result is so worth the effort. I have this stacked, pointy kind of shape that looks great in triangles, but it also looks great in rectangles. Using the pineapple design in rectangle shaped blocks is as easy as quilting to triangle and then continuing on with the design as normal. Quilting that pineapple design in each of the rectangles allows it to come together and surround that center fabric and kind of show it off. For a slightly different look, you can change the orientation of the pineapple design. Instead of having it aimed towards the center, I have it aimed away from the center. I think it makes more of a star kind of effect around the outside. Whereas in this example, I think it really shows off the center fabric. You can also use the pineapple design within a square. By using the quilting to break the square up into 4 triangles, you can quilt that pineapple motif in each of the triangles to create a really cool, intricate looking motif. Try using the pineapple motif to group together smaller blocks or as a way to draw interest to the center of a bigger solid block. It's just a great example that how you use a design can really help you highlight or hide different portions of your quilts. Now let's see how we can use it in irregularly shaped areas, and I'm going to demonstrate that on a long arm. To use the pineapple design in this irregularly shaped area, I'm going to create a triangle shape by quilting a line from one corner to the opposite side. Even though it's not a perfect triangle, I can still quilt the diamond design in this area, just as we saw on the sewing machine. Creating triangle shapes and then quilting inside them with the diamond design. Traveling along the seam allows me to quilt the different sections without having to start a new line of quilting. Try not to let the thought of that scare you. Even if it's not perfectly on the line, once you step back, all you're going to see is the gorgeous quilting. And if you're left with any unquilted areas that are too big to leave unquilted, just add another line to the design. Using the design in consecutive blocks is a fun way to pull them together. In this example, I quilted the pineapple designs so that they mirrored each other. And while every block might be a little different, just remember you can use the quilting to create the shape that you want to fill in. There are a lot of different ways that you can go about doing this, but don't let it intimidate you. Instead, think of it as a way to flex your creative quilting muscles. Now here's another example of using the quilting to create a space that we want to fill in. Looking at the chevron area, I've decided that I can quilt a line from one corner to the next and on to the opposite to create a triangle that I can then fill in with that diamond design. Now when using this technique, you might end up with areas that are a little too big to leave unquilted. If that happens, you can fill in with wedges or another design to complete the motif. Now that I have that triangle area defined, I'm going to quilt another line that goes from the corner, ending about an inch or so inside the previously quilted line and out to the opposite corner. Then to fill in this unquilted area, I'm going to quilt a few wedges. Then travel along the bottom edge of the block to do the same on the other side. What's kind of fun about combining designs or using them to break up the area and make different shapes is that sometimes you never know exactly what it's going to look like until you're done. And when we're done, I have a beautiful dot-to-dot motif that combines the diamond design and wedges from the starburst design to fill in that irregularly shaped area. Hopefully this has inspired you to use dot-to-dot designs in all areas of your quilt, whether it's the perfectly shaped square block or an irregular area that you can fill in just perfectly. You can combine designs, you can break the shape into smaller pieces, or use a filler to fill in any of those gaps. Now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel I designed for the challenge, go ahead and fill the areas highlighted in red with the dot-to-dot designs of your choice. And as always, I put together a free downloadable PDF with quilting diagrams and tips to help you be successful with using the dot-to-dot designs in those irregularly shaped areas of your quilt. And if you need a little bit more help, a little more assistance, you can check out the expanded resource PDF I've put together. For a few extra dollars, you get step-by-step diagrams, more tips, and more quilting examples. To find out the information on both of those, you can click the link in the description box below or scan the QR code. I'll be back soon with the next video in the series where we're going to learn how to use that dot-to-dot technique to fill in the center part of our panel. Until then, everyone, happy quilting!